They said it was supposed to be a lesson. A demonstration. A gentle, carefully arranged humiliation designed to remind the newest members of the Galactic Coalition exactly where they stood in the order of things. They were wrong. The Vorkai had been soldiers for 600 years before humans figured out how to smelt iron. Their bodies were built for war, 7 feet of layered muscle wrapped in natural exoskeletal plating, for arms, compound eyes that saw in 17 spectral ranges simultaneously, and a nervous system so fast it made human reaction time look like a geological event. They did not lose battles. They had not lost a battle in 4 generations. Their military record was not a record so much as a monument, something you carved into stone and pointed at. So when High Commander Drethas Vor received the assignment to oversee the Coalition's newest joint training exercise, he accepted it the way a cathedral accepts tourists. With towering patience and mild, distant contempt. The exercise was simple. 1 Vorkai battalion, 500 soldiers, full gear, live simulation munitions, would engage a single company of human cadets fresh out of their first year at the Coalition Military Academy. The humans would be given standard-issue equipment, no special briefing, and 48 hours on Terrain Grid 7, a mid-complexity simulation environment of broken urban landscape and dense woodland fringe. The goal, as written in the official brief, was interspecies tactical familiarization. The actual goal, which everyone in the room understood and nobody said out loud, was to give the Vorkai something to do between real deployments while the human cadets learned what it felt like to lose gracefully. Commander Drethas reviewed the cadet roster on the transport down. 83 humans. Average age 19 standard cycles. Their species had been in the Coalition for 11 years. They had contributed pilots, engineers, diplomats, and an inexplicable surplus of comedians to the joint services. Their military divisions were considered promising in the way that a sapling is considered promising, technically alive, theoretically capable of becoming something, but in need of decades before anyone took it seriously. He scrolled past names. Fletcher, Ayose, K. Vesquez, M. Reinhold, C. One name had a small red flag beside it. Cadet First Class Marin Solis. The note attached read, Disciplinary Record Insubordination X3, Unauthorized Modification of Simulation Equipment X2, 1 incident involving a training drone and a catapult that the review board officially classified as an accident and unofficially refused to discuss. Drethas set the file down. He was not worried. He was, if he was being honest with the private architecture of his own mind, mildly curious. Marin Solis had not slept in 31 hours, which was normal for her, and she was eating a protein block that tasted like someone had described cardboard to a person who had never seen cardboard, which was also normal, and she was staring at a terrain map of Grid 7 with the focused intensity of someone who had already decided to do something and was now just working out how badly it could go wrong. The answer, she had calculated, was pretty badly. But pretty badly was survivable, and survivable was all she needed. Around her, the rest of the company was doing what soldiers always do in the 12 hours before a thing. Some were sleeping, some were sharpening gear that didn't need sharpening, some were talking too loud about nothing because talking too loud about nothing is the universal human response to controlled fear. Cadet Kwame Osei was doing push-ups in the corner. He had been doing push-ups since the briefing. Nobody had counted how many. The number had stopped being relevant. They gave us 48 hours, said Cadet Reinhold, dropping onto the bench beside Marin without asking if there was room. There was not really room. He sat anyway. Against 500 Vorkai. With standard gear. I know. That's 500 soldiers who have been fighting since before our grandparents were born. I know that too. So what are you looking at? Marin turned the map so he could see it. She had made marks on it, not the clean, regulation marks they taught in tactical theory, but dense, overlapping scroll that covered the terrain grid in what looked, at first glance, like the notes of someone having a very organized mental breakdown. Reinhold stared at it. What am I looking at? Choke points, she said. Every place the terrain forces movement into a predictable path. Drainage gullies. Collapsed overpass sections. The tree line break at Sector 9. She tapped a cluster of marks near the eastern edge. And, here, this is a processing facility. Decommissioned. The internal structures still in the grid file. 3 entry points, 1 major through route, elevated positions on the second floor with sightlines covering 240 degrees. That's a defensive position. It's a trap, she said. If you use it right. Reinhold was quiet for a moment. They have 500 soldiers, Marin. They have 500 soldiers who expect us to run, she said. Big difference. Dreyfus landed on grid 7 at dawn plus 2 hours and immediately felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He stood at the command elevation, a ridge overlooking the full simulation terrain, and watched his battalion deploy with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from 10,000 hours of shared training, and he felt, underneath the professional calm, a faint and inexplicable unease. It wasn't the terrain. He had fought on worse. It wasn't the humans. He had evaluated their files. Children, essentially. It was the silence. He had expected to detect the cadet company on initial sweep. Standard thermal, motion, and spectral scanning should have located 83 warm-blooded humans within 30 seconds of deployment. His scanner operators swept the grid twice and reported nothing in the open. Faint signatures, dispersed, consistent with small groups of 2 to 3 individuals operating under cover. They had already scattered. Sub-Commander Velith, standing to his right, made a sound that was the Vorkai equivalent of a shrug. They're hiding. Expected. They'll consolidate when pressure is applied. Standard prey behavior. Dreyfus said nothing. He looked at the terrain map. He looked at the silence where 83 humans had been an hour ago and were no longer. He thought about the cadet file with the red flag. He sent the order to advance. The first contact happened in Sector 4. A Vorkai flanking unit of 12 soldiers moved through the drainage gully at standard patrol speed, fast, loud by most species standards, confident. They had swept the gully entrance with full sensor arrays and found nothing. What they found inside the gully was different. It took about 4 seconds. That was enough time for the simulation munitions, practice rounds, non-lethal, but scored by the exercise AI as kill confirmed, to register 11 of the 12 soldiers as eliminated. The 12th escaped because the 12th tripped over a root and fell, which was not a tactical maneuver but functioned as one, and the ambush hadn't accounted for someone falling at exactly the right moment, which was the sort of variable that never appeared in pre-exercise calculations. The survivor reported back. Dreyfus listened to the report with the expression of a man who had been told that a minor administrative error had somehow resulted in the building being on fire. 11, he said. Eliminated, sir. The ambush was preset. Trigger mechanism was motion activated. They were not present at the site. By the time we engaged, they had already moved. Where? Unknown, sir. No thermal trace. We believe they applied some kind of. The soldier paused, and, in the pause was something that was almost embarrassment, some kind of thermal masking compound. Improvised. Improvised, Dreyfus repeated. From what we can determine, sir, they used the insulation lining from their standard issue sleeping rolls. Silence. Velith made a different sound now. Not a shrug. Something more careful. By hour 6, the Vorkai had taken 43 simulated casualties without making confirmed contact with a single human cadet. The pattern was always the same. Sensors would pick up a trace, small, fast, immediately gone. A unit would move to investigate. Something would happen. An improvised trap, a prepared collapse, twice a system of rope and counterweight mechanisms that the exercise AI logged as unauthorized equipment modification before dutifully scoring the resulting simulated casualties as valid. The humans were not fighting them. They were operating on them, the way water operates on stone, not in a single blow but in 10,000 small decisions that added up to something the stone never saw coming. Dreyfus had, over the course of 4 decades of military command, never once requested a tactical pause in an exercise involving junior cadets. He requested one now. He stood at the command elevation and looked at his numbers and thought about the girl with the red flag in her file and thought about the word insubordination and thought that maybe he had made an error somewhere in the category of expectations. Velith stood beside him. We still have 457 active personnel. They have 83 cadets. Yes, sir. And, we have taken 43 casualties in 6 hours without visual confirmation of a single target. Also yes, sir. There was a pause. Velith, said Drethas. What do we know about human military history? Velith hesitated. This was not a question that appeared in standard pre-exercise briefings. They've been in the coalition 11 years. Their military development is, before the coalition, Drethas said. Their own history. On their own world. Velith was quiet for a moment. I don't have that file in front of me, sir. Get it, said Drethas. Something that was not quite worry had settled into his chest, into the space behind his primary heart where the old soldier's instinct lived. Get it immediately. He looked out over the terrain. The silence had not changed. The humans were still out there, still invisible, still moving. Somewhere in Sector 9, a Vorkai patrol was about to reach the tree line break. Drethas didn't know that yet. He would know it in about 4 minutes when the patrol reported back. He did not know what they were going to say. He suspected, with the full weight of 40 years of experience pressing on his spine, that he was not going to enjoy finding out. The patrol at Sector 9 came back with 8 personnel instead of 14, and the 2 who were doing the reporting were doing it in the stiff, careful way of soldiers who had recently experienced something they had not been given vocabulary for. The patrol leader, a veteran of the Kareth campaign and 3 border engagements, stood in front of Sub-Commander Velith and said the following: We entered the tree line break at standard interval. Sensors showed no activity in a 300-meter radius. At the 70-meter mark, the ground gave way. Gave way, said Velith. A pit, sir. Covered with natural debris. We lost 4 to the fall impact simulation scores, non-lethal, but enough to count as eliminated. Then, from the elevated position at the north edge of the facility he stopped. Continue. There were 2 humans, sir. On the roof. With what appeared to be modified slingshot mechanisms constructed from cabling they stripped from the facility's internal wiring infrastructure. He paused again, as if waiting for permission to say the next part. They were extremely accurate. Velith looked at the patrol leader for a long moment. The patrol leader looked at the ground. Neither of them said what both of them were thinking, which was that 600 years of Vorkai military tradition had just been conditionally embarrassed by teenagers with improvised catapults on a roof. Drethas had read the human history file by then. He was very quiet. He had been very quiet for about 20 minutes, which was the time it took him to read the file, and the quality of his silence had changed during that time. It had started as the silence of a commander waiting for information and become the silence of someone standing at the edge of something large and trying to assess the distance to the bottom. The file was not short. 10,000 years of recorded conflict on a single planet. No external enemy to unite against. Just humans, fighting each other, continuously, in every terrain type the planet offered: desert, Arctic, jungle, mountain, ocean, urban rubble, developing doctrine and counter-doctrine and counter-counter-doctrine in a cycle that had never fully stopped, and building into their cultural and cognitive inheritance a particular kind of knowledge that did not have a clean name in Vorkai military taxonomy. The closest translation was something like, the art of losing badly for a long time and surviving anyway. They had a word for it themselves, several words in several languages, but the concept underneath all of them was the same. You were outnumbered. You were outgunned. Your equipment was worse. The terrain was not yours. And none of that was enough to stop you, because stopping was the one thing you had decided, collectively, across 10,000 years of getting beaten and getting back up, was not actually an option. He set the file down. He looked at the terrain grid. He did the math. 43 casualties. 11 from the first ambush in the drainage gully. 6 from the tree line pit. 8 from the facility rooftop. The rest from a series of micro-engagements scattered across 7 sectors that his battalion had not yet successfully mapped into a coherent tactical picture, because the engagements were not meant to be a coherent tactical picture. They were meant to be noise. Each individual action was too small to constitute a battle. Put together, they were something else. They were the patient, methodical dismantling of a force 3 times their size. They are not trying to win, he said. Velith turned. Sir? They are not attempting to win the engagement in the conventional sense. They are not assembling force, they are not seeking a decisive confrontation, they are not trying to take ground. He looked at the casualty report. They are trying to make this unsustainable. For us. They are running the numbers and waiting for the numbers to change. Velith looked at the casualty count. Then, at the full battalion strength. Then, back at the casualty count. They would need to, at this rate, and, assuming they have enough terrain prepared, which based on the time they had and what they've already demonstrated, I'm no longer willing to assume they don't, they could make this statistically unwinnable for us within the exercise window. Drethas paused. Without ever meeting us in a direct engagement. There was a silence. That is, Velith said carefully, an unusual doctrine. It's not a doctrine, said Drethas. It's an instinct. Marin was, at that moment, eating the last of her protein blocks and watching Kwame rewire a trip sensor mechanism with a piece of wire he had stripped out of a decommissioned lighting panel, and she was thinking about the next 6 hours and the numbers she had run in her head and the numbers that were still not quite adding up the way she needed them to. She had 41 cadets on active status. 12 had been caught, not eliminated, but cornered and forced to surrender, which counted as removed from play under the exercise rules. 5 had been genuinely eliminated by Vorkai contacts that she hadn't been able to account for in her initial planning. 25 were still in position, dispersed across the terrain in 3-person units operating on a communication schedule that used light signals because the Vorkai sensor arrays were calibrated for radio frequency and had taken them about 2 hours to figure out. The problem was the facility. The facility was the center of the plan, it was where the final stage had to happen, because it was the one location in the terrain where the geometry worked in their favor. But, the Vorkai knew about the facility now. They had taken casualties there. They would not approach the facility again without a serious tactical response, which meant they were building one, which meant she had a window and the window was closing. Kwame finished the rewire and held the sensor up to the light and looked at it with the focused calm of a person who was very good at one thing and had decided to be very good at it very efficiently. Working, he said. That's the last of them? That's the last of the ones we can build with what we have left, he said, which was not quite the same thing, but she took it. Reinhold was on watch at the north end of the building. He leaned in from the doorway without moving his eyes from the tree line. They've stopped moving. Marin looked up. They've been static for 22 minutes, he said. All the patrol routes stopped. They're recalibrating, she said. Good or bad for us? She thought about it. About Drethas Vor's file, which she had read 3 times since the briefing was announced. 40 years of command. The Karath campaign. The Outer Belt pacification. A military mind that old and that experience did not make the same mistake twice. It means he figured out what we're doing, she said. Kwame looked at her. Reinhold looked at her. So now he's going to do something we haven't planned for, she said. Which means we have maybe 4 hours before the thing we haven't planned for shows up. She stood. So we need to be done by then, Drethas sent 6 units simultaneously. Not sequential sweeps, the pattern the humans had been exploiting for 6 hours, but 6 converging movements timed to arrive at the facility from 6 different approach vectors within a 90-second window. He had calculated the minimum possible ambush setup time and divided it by 6. No unit would be in any prepared kill zone long enough to take significant casualties. They would compress the human options from 6 directions at once and make the facility untenable. It was sound tactics. He had used it successfully in 4 engagements. He watched the grid. The first unit reached the facility's outer perimeter at time 0. Standard sensor sweep clean. They moved in. The second unit reached the east approach at time 0 plus 31 seconds and encountered something that was not on the terrain grid, because it had not been there when the terrain grid was logged. A series of interconnected wire barriers, low to the ground, strung between the structural supports of the facility's loading dock, some of them connected to small noise-making mechanisms that triggered when disturbed, some of them not connected to anything, all of them requiring the unit to slow down and pick through them carefully while the clock ran. The third unit reached the west approach and found the entrance they had been planning to use had been narrowed, physically narrowed, with debris that had been moved and stacked with structural deliberateness to a gap that permitted single-file entry only. Single file. Against opponents using elevated positions. The fourth unit did not report back for 11 minutes. When they did, they reported for eliminated personnel and a completely disorienting experience in the facility's lower level, which was dark, because the lighting grid had been removed, and contained a series of baffles constructed from wall paneling that turned the interior geometry into something that bore no relationship to the layout on the grid file. Drethus stood at the command elevation. He was watching the situation reports come in with the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a closet and found a hallway that continues further than any hallway has a reasonable right to continue. They modified the interior, Veleth said. Not a question. Processing. They modified the interior, Drethus confirmed. They removed the lighting elements, relocated structural dividers, and created a maze inside the facility using materials from the facility itself. In 48 hours. With standard issue equipment and whatever they could strip from a decommissioned building. Another report came in. Unit 5 had reached the north roof access and found it occupied, but the cadets on the roof had retreated through an interior hatch before Unit 5 could get a simulation lock, because the hatch had been rigged to open from both sides and the interior of the building was dark and confusing and full of walls that should not have been walls. The total new casualties from the 6-unit coordinated push, 27. Drethus's total simulated losses were now 71. He had 429 active personnel. The humans had, he checked, 31 cadets still in play. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Sir, said Veleth, and his voice had something in it that was not quite anything Drethus had heard from him in 11 years of shared service, do you want me to begin withdrawal planning? Drethus turned to look at him. We retain the numerical advantage, Veleth said carefully, but, at the current rate of attrition, and, with the terrain modifications they've made, and, accounting for the remaining exercise window, we have 26 hours remaining, Drethus said. Yes, sir. And, if the current rate holds. The simulations break the battalion threshold at approximately hour 31. Which is 5 hours past the exercise window. Yes. But, sir, the current rate will not hold. It will accelerate. They have prepared terrain we haven't found yet. Every hour the battalion operates in that building increases the effective casualty rate. Veleth paused. They did this on purpose. The building is not a defensive position. The building is the trap. Drethus looked at the facility on the grid map. He thought about the girl with the red flag and the improvised catapult incident that the review board had officially classified as an accident. He thought, yes. He thought, obviously. He thought, I walked every single one of my soldiers into it anyway. Outside, somewhere in the dark and the modified corridors of a building that no longer resembled its own floor plan, 31 human cadets were waiting. Not panicking. Not celebrating prematurely. Just waiting, with the particular patience of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how to wait out a thing that was bigger than them. Drethus looked at the grid one more time. He thought about the conversation he was going to have with High Command. He thought about the word familiarization in the exercise brief and the gap between what that word meant when written and what it apparently meant in practice. He thought about 600 years of unbroken military record and what it meant to have your first real test of that record be 83 teenagers with improvised wire traps and a map they had clearly spent a very long time thinking about. He looked at Veleth. Get me the cadet company commander, he said. Veleth stared at him. Not to negotiate, Drethus said, and something in his voice had shifted, had become something colder and more careful than anything Veleth had heard from him in 11 years. I want to talk to her. The signal came through on a coalition command frequency, which meant it bypassed all the improvised light signal protocols and showed up on the one piece of standard-issue equipment Marin had kept active, the emergency comms unit that she had not touched for the entire exercise because touching it would have lit up like a beacon on every Vorkai sensor array in the grid. It was now lighting up like a beacon on every Vorkai sensor array in the grid. She looked at it. Kwame looked at it. Reinhold looked at it from the doorway. "That's a command frequency," said Kwame. "I know. That's their command frequency." "I know that too." She picked it up. The voice on the other end was not what she expected. She had expected clipped, professional, the crisp authority of a senior officer doing the polite administrative version of a thing that was actually a threat. What she got was something quieter. A voice that had been a lot of places and seen what happens when tactics stop being theoretical. "Cadet Solis," said Drithas Vor. "I have a question for you." She said nothing. Letting the silence run was the right move and she knew it and she did it. "The pit at Sector 9, he said. "You had that built before we even landed on the grid." "Yes, sir." "How long before?" She thought about it. There was no tactical advantage in lying. 31 hours, sir. I had the hole started 4 hours after the terrain file was issued. My unit worked through the night. A pause on his end. The interior modifications to the facility. 18 hours of work, sir. Rotating shifts. We slept in 4-hour blocks. Another pause, longer. She could hear him breathing a different rhythm than a human's, the Vorkai two-lung system creating a double beat that was easy to identify once you knew what to listen for. "The thermal masking," he said. "Standard sleeping roll insulation, sir. The reflective interior lining. We cut it into strips and layered it. It doesn't block thermal completely but it diffuses the signature enough that your sensors read it as residual heat from the terrain rather than a body." "You tested that?" "The night before the exercise briefing, sir. In our barracks. I had Reinhold hold a heat source behind a layered section and we read it on the standard sensor kit we checked out from the equipment pool." She paused. "It's logged as a scheduled sensor calibration check." There was a silence that was not the kind of silence she had been expecting at any point in this conversation. "Cadet Solis," said Drithas Vor, "I want to be precise about something. You came into this exercise knowing you would be facing a Vorkai battalion." "Yes, sir." "And you spent 31 hours of pre-exercise time on terrain preparation." "Yes, sir." "And you briefed 83 cadets on a plan that required 12 hours of construction, rotating sleep schedules, improvised thermal countermeasures, sensor delay mechanisms, coordinated light signal communications, and the physical reconstruction of a building's interior architecture." 81 cadets, sir. 2 had medical holds. A beat. 81. And they all followed the plan. This was the question under the question and she knew it. They trusted the plan, sir. Different thing. Drithas Vor was quiet for a long time. He had her on the line for 47 minutes. Velith stood 3 feet away and did not speak and did not leave because leaving felt wrong, felt like abandoning a post, even though the post was technically just standing in the command area watching his commander talk to a 19-year-old human in a building full of walls that shouldn't have been walls. He listened to Drithas ask about the plan and the cadet answer and the plan expand in the answering into something that was more than a plan. It was a system, a series of nested contingencies built to account for Vorkai tactical doctrine the way a lock is built to account for a specific key, except the key was 600 years of military tradition and the lock was a 19-year-old human with a protein block and a terrain map covered in overlapping scrawl. "You anticipated the 6-unit push," said Drithas. "It was not a question. I anticipated a multi-vector coordinated push, sir. The specific vectors I couldn't know. But the timing window creates a minimum response interval regardless of vector, so I prepared the wire barriers and the entry narrowing to eat into that interval. The goal wasn't to stop the push. The goal was to slow it down enough that the position inside the building was worth more than the cost of reaching it. The darkness. Equalizer, sir. Your sensor systems are better than ours in open terrain. Inside a dark building with modified geometry, the advantage narrows. We've been training on building clearance under degraded visibility conditions for 6 months. It's on our curriculum. A pause that Veleth recognized, after a moment, as humor. Apparently it's not on the Vorkai familiarization brief. Drethas made a sound. Veleth had heard that sound twice in 11 years, and, both times it had come at the end of something significant, at the moment when the thing that had seemed like one shape from a distance revealed itself to be another shape entirely, and, the commander's mind adjusted. No, said Drethas. It is not. We also trained it on a terrain with no prior mapping because I pulled the wrong grid file the first week of the semester and, we ran the exercise on a building that didn't match the floor plan we'd been issued. She stopped. That was an accident. The training value was not. Your disciplinary file includes 2 incidents of unauthorized equipment modification. The first was adding a secondary targeting reticle to a standard drone unit that the manufacturers had the capacity for but hadn't enabled. The second was a bit more complicated. The catapult. The review board's classification of that incident as an accident is technically accurate in the sense that the outcome was not what I intended, sir. I had intended the range to be significantly shorter. Drethas made that sound again. Solis. Sir. Your current casualty count. She read it to him. 17 eliminated, 12 removed from play. 52 active. He said, you gained 11 since we last tallied. The 6-unit push was an opportunity, sir. The wire barriers weren't just delay mechanisms. A pause. Of course they weren't, said Drethas. The conversation ended without a formal outcome, which Marin logged in her head as neither a win nor a loss and, which Reinhold immediately interpreted as a win and, which Kwame, who had been listening from 6 feet away with the expression of someone calculating something very specific, said nothing about at all. She set the comm unit down. He's going to do something different now, said Kwame. Yes. Something we haven't planned for. Probably. So what do we do? Marin looked at the terrain map, which was by now annotated so heavily in her own overlapping scrawl that the original grid lines were barely visible underneath it. She thought about Drethas Vor's voice on the comm, the quality of it, the weight behind the questions, the way a man who had been asking questions for 40 years sounds different from someone asking questions for the first time. He wasn't trying to find a weakness. He was trying to understand a thing. That was more dangerous. We do what we've been doing, she said. We stay in motion. We don't give him a fixed point to aim at. She looked at Kwame. How long until the next team rotates through the North Corridor? 40 minutes. Move it to 20. And, tell Vasquez's unit to shift the 4th floor positions. She thought for a moment. North side. Move to south. He'll be adjusting his sensor coverage to account for what he found during the push, the south side's going to be the gap. Kwame looked at her. He's smart, she said. Which means we have to assume he's already thought of the thing we think he hasn't thought of. She paused. Except he's been fighting armies that fight back the way armies are supposed to fight back. He's not used to thinking about an enemy that doesn't want to fight him at all. Drethas' second approach was nothing like the first. He pulled the battalion back from the facility entirely. He established a cordon. A wide cordon, wider than the cadets' estimated operational range, anchored by sensor arrays at regular intervals. He sealed the terrain. Not attacking. Not engaging. Containing. The logic was clean. If he couldn't beat them inside the terrain, he would make the terrain smaller. Compress the operating space until the humans ran out of room to operate in. It was the right call. He was proud of it. He began the cordon at hour 31 of the exercise. The humans had already moved through the Sector 9 gap 12 minutes before the cordon closed. All 52 of them. He got the report and stood with it for a moment, holding it the way you hold something fragile when you have just realized you have been handling it wrong. They had moved through the gap that he had left intentionally, that he had decided to leave because it was the natural terrain bottle that anyone moving in a hurry would use, and he had concentrated sensor coverage there to confirm they would use it, and then he would close the cordon around them in the open terrain beyond the facility where his battalion's advantages were fully restored. The sensors had not detected them. He checked the sensor logs. The thermal diffusion. The timing. 52 human-sized thermal signatures moving through a sensor-covered choke point, all reading as residual ground heat, all moving in a pattern that matched the way the ground temperature in that sector had been shifting for the last 2 hours due to normal diurnal cooling. They had been watching the ground temperature change and they had timed their movement to the temperature gradient. He put the sensor log down. "Velith," he said. "Sir. How long have humans had thermal sensors?" "The military application was documented approximately 80 standard years ago, sir. They developed it domestically, prior to coalition contact." "And how long did it take them to start thinking about how to defeat it?" Velith was quiet. "Find me their position," said Drethus. He found her at hour 38. Not because his sensors caught her, but because she wanted to be found, or rather, because she had moved to the one place on the terrain grid that required a direct approach with no good flanking option, and had left enough trace for a commander who was paying attention to follow without being entirely sure he was supposed to follow until he was already there. They met on open ground, which was not how exercises ended, and both of them knew it. She was 19. Shorter than he had expected, which was itself a foolish expectation because he knew very well that humans were shorter than Vorkai and had been told this at least 100 times, and it still, every time, landed differently in person. She had a protein block in one hand and a terrain map in the other, and the terrain map looked like a document that had survived a minor explosion and, then, been annotated by 3 different people during the explosion. He looked at her. She looked at him, with the direct, measuring look of someone who has been waiting to see if a person matches the file she built in her head and is adjusting the file in real time. "I expected you earlier," she said. "I know," he said. "You left the trace at hour 32. She said nothing. "You wanted to see if I would follow it or if I would try to run the cordon another way." He looked at the map in her hand. "You had a contingency for the other way." "I had 4 contingencies," she said. "This was the one I preferred." He looked at the map. He looked at her. He looked at the terrain around them, where the rest of the exercise was still theoretically ongoing, where 30 cadets and 400 soldiers were still somewhere in the grid doing things that both of them had, effectively, stepped away from. "I want to propose something," he said. "Sir. This exercise will formally conclude in 10 hours with the Coalition Exercise AI issuing a final assessment. That assessment will note the current casualty distribution and render a judgment on tactical performance." He paused. "The judgment, under current metrics, will not favor my battalion." Marin said nothing. "The metrics," said Drethus, "were designed to assess interspecies tactical familiarization. They were not designed to assess what actually happened here." He looked at her steadily. "What actually happened here was something I do not have adequate vocabulary for in my own language. I am going to need to develop some." She was quiet for a moment. "Sir. I am going to recommend to Coalition High Command that the training exercise metrics be revised," he said. "And I am going to recommend that the methodology used by your company in this exercise be formally documented and studied as an independent tactical framework." A pause. "I would like your help with the documentation." Marin looked at him. "You are 19 standard cycles," he said. "You have 11 years of human membership in the coalition. You have been fighting, as a species, for approximately 10,000 years." He looked at the map in her hand. "We have been fighting for 600. I am beginning to think we have been learning the wrong things from that number." She looked at the terrain map. She looked at it for a long time. Around them the grid stretched out, full of cadets moving in patterns she had designed and soldiers trying to find them and a building full of walls that didn't exist 12 days ago, and the whole of it was quiet in the way that things are quiet when something has already been decided and is still in the process of knowing it. "The documentation," she said. "Yes. I'll need the sensor logs from the first 8 hours. Drithas looked at her. For the thermal diffusion timing, she said. If we're documenting it properly, we need the actual data. Not the summarized reports, the raw logs. She paused. Also the grid mapping data from before and after the interior modifications, comparative. And the patrol route data from the pre-static period. He was quiet for a long time. You're not going to write a report, he said. You're going to write a manual. Marin looked at him with the particular steady look of someone who has been thinking about something for a very long time and is finally in a room with someone who can hear it. I'm going to write the thing I wish someone had handed me before I spent 31 hours digging a pit in the dark, she said. Drithas Vor, High Commander of the Vorkai 1st Coalition Battalion, veteran of the Kareth campaign and 3 border engagements, stood on the open ground of Terrain Grid 7 and looked at the human cadet in front of him and thought about 600 years and what they were worth and what, precisely, a person did with the answer to that question. He thought, she already knows. All right, he said. You'll have the logs by morning. She nodded. She started to turn. Stopped. Sir. Cadet. The pit at Sector 9. The 4 personnel who were eliminated by the fall. She didn't quite look at him. I estimated 3. I'm sorry about the 4th. He looked at her for a moment. They are fine, he said. It is a simulation. I know, she said. I'm still sorry about the 4th. She walked back into the terrain. The map was still in her hand, annotations multiplying. Somewhere behind her, the exercise AI was tallying numbers that were going to create a significant administrative problem for at least 6 departments and a very long meeting at Coalition High Command and one very unusual after-action report that would be, in its way, the first page of something neither of them had a name for yet. She was already writing it in her head. The grid stretched out around her, dark and modified and full of walls that shouldn't have been walls. She walked through it like she'd built it herself. Because she had.